Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I am your host, Brian Scott. We are returning to Carlos Castaneda today and his fascinating work, The Art of Dreaming, which is a discussion of lucid dreaming by Carlos Castaneda. But it's a good point for us to give you some background information about the Carlos Castaneda story, more in specific. Carlos Castaneda was at one time considered just a sort of New Age guru, but they could not prove the existence of Don Juan, and it appears that Don Juan was not true. But something happened around his death. There were some suicides with some women that were close to him, and there were some unusual happenings around him. So there's going to be some names given and some characters talked about in this next chapter. And when you know the background information about Carlos Castaneda, it sort of blows you away. There may be truth in what we're reading here, and we could see that some sort of thing happened by the people that surrounded him and the stories that he told. One of the most fascinating books to read is The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Amy Wallace, who dated Castaneda, but also was deeply into his material and related what her own feelings were, because she was talking to all these women that were in the group. And it felt like a very realistic version of what was really going on behind the scenes with Castaneda. And I want to read a few passages from that book, but also give you some of the background about the story. A lot of the story with Carlos Castaneda could be on an Unsolved Mysteries episode. Many people say that he started a cult, and perhaps he did. He did cult-like things, and it's good for us as the neutral observer to observe this. In the spring of '98, shortly after the death of Carlos Castaneda, 5 women closely connected with Castaneda and his movement called Tensegrity vanished from the Los Angeles area. Their names were Florinda Donner-Grau, Taisha Abelar, Amalia Marquez, Kylie Lundahl, and Patricia Lee Partin. Also from Partin, whose remains were discovered in 2003, all of the women remain missing to this day. The story behind their disappearance is strange, tangled, and it's somewhat disturbing. Peruvian-born Carlos Castaneda was a graduate student in anthropology at UCLA in the early 1960s when he published a book called The Teachings of Don Juan, which purported to detail his apprenticeship with a Yaqui Indian called Don Juan Matus. Supposedly, this Don Juan took Castaneda on various spiritual journeys and showed him new ways of knowledge based on Native American mystical traditions. Many say that it was all a hoax. Don Juan did not exist, and various investigations proved that Castaneda fabricated many important events in his past. Castaneda's doctorate awarded for the Don Juan project was apparently obtained by fraud. Castaneda dropped out of sight in '73, and while continuing to write, repackaged his philosophy as Tensegrity, which he said was delivered from the teachings of the non-existent Don Juan, or perhaps existing through multiple personalities, and he used the Don Juan persona as a way of covering for who they truly were. It's possible that these women were the Don Juan that we're talking about. And various Native American philosophies. While pushing the Tensegrity system, it was promoted mainly through workshops. Castaneda amassed a number of female followers who typically changed their names and went into seclusion with him. A number of these women were apparently his lovers. A chilling memoir is the Amy Wallace book, Sorcerer's Apprentice. So the interesting thing is Castaneda dies in '98, and they don't release that to the public for 3 months. And I recommend that you look up some articles on this to get further information. It's super fascinating. SeanMunger.com on his blog has an article on disappearance, the women of Tensegrity missing since 1998. And so the interesting story about Florinda Donner-Grau, also known as Regine Margarita Tai, she met Castaneda at UCLA, and she was studying anthropology as well, and went to live with him. And she published a book called Shabono, A Visit to a Remote Magical World in the South American Rainforest. The book was about Yanomami Indians of the Amazon region, and she hinted but did not seem to claim specifically that she lived among them. The claim was debunked in '83, and she came out and cobbled together an account of Yanomami from various other sources, and they changed the book into a fictional book when it was sold, which sounds familiar to what Carlos Castaneda did. It's interesting how we attract similar people with similar ideas and interests around us. So at the end of Amy Walsh's book, she gives some more information about these characters, but we learn a little bit about her first meeting with Florinda Grau. When she's talking about Carlos Castaneda, it is probably the most intimate description of Castaneda and his philosophy and what it was really like to be hanging out with him. But she first mentions Florinda Donner-Grau when she says, "When I did see Carlos, he was usually with Annie. However, I soon met a second woman, the witch Carlos had described as Federico Fellini's sweetheart. She was no longer known as Gina. She was known as Florinda Donner-Grau. And she was a dynamo. She had so much energy, she always seemed about to explode. If anyone looked capable of human spontaneous combustion, a la Don Juan, it was she. And Florinda was fiercely talkative, the opposite of the demure Anna Marie. And unlike Annie, talked back to Carlos. They bantered with florid, exhibitionistic pleasure. They used the worst possible gutter language, mixing Spanish and English. She reminded me of the wild bird, alert and untamed. Her nickname, the hummingbird, suited her to perfection, for she was a diminutive, beautiful creature in perpetual motion. While Annie's conversation was immensely engaging, her storytelling powers, equal to Carlos, she dwelt on ordinary topics. Florinda, like Carlos, spoke of escape from the mundane world of mortals, which they called the Sea of Gargoyles. Oddly, I don't recall my first meeting with Florinda. While she was to have the most powerful influence on my life of all the sorcerers, including Carlos, she was frequently Carlos' companion during his surprise visits and very quickly became a role model for me, feisty, brilliant, daring, and seemingly fearless. If you read the whole book, she has tons of descriptions, 300 or 400 of them, of her experiences with Florinda Donner-Grau, and she's an impressive character in that book and is clearly practicing the shamanic practices that Carlos Castaneda was practicing. He was doing something. It was coming from somewhere, and these girls were following it. The tensegrity information is interesting, and the way that Transurfing has adapted this information, there is some truth within it. As Neville Goddard says, there is no fiction. I recently heard Frederick Dotson mention Carlos Castaneda in his book on the levels of heaven and hell. An amazing book, by the way. And he mentions that Castaneda had a very negative view of the afterlife, that we are eaten in our afterlife and we can protect ourselves by changing our energy body, and that he found it not reputable and did not believe in its truth. So I found that interesting, and that mention is important. Now, to go back to the last episode, we read a chapter called The Shadow's World, and it talked about in the dream that Castaneda is having, he's taken to the shadow world, and we're introduced to the Blue Scout, and he's sort of flying through this sponge-like thing, and we're related the stories of the sorcerers of Atlantis who had found power by going into these dreams, following these scouts, and Don Juan recommends against going into these places and warns Don Juan on numerous occasions that his excursions into this dream territory, he could get lost or taken away permanently. And he sees this Blue Scout who appears to be a prisoner in this world and declares to save this Blue Scout. That is how the last chapter ended. A lot of people commented on how it ended and how they wanted to know what happened next, as did I. And then as I started to read it, and I saw the mentions of Florinda Grau and this other character, Carol Tiggs, I could see that there may have been something really going on here in his world that was somewhat truly reflective of what he was writing about in this book, The Art of Dreaming. Now, we get a mention of Carol Tiggs in the chapter in The Sorcerer's Apprentice where she says, "I meet an alien." Remember, we are talking about the Blue Scout. On my next visit, Wallace says to Los Angeles, Carlos was anxious for me to meet his daughter. The Art of Dreaming, Carlos' soon-to-be-published manuscript, explained her alien origins. Carlos described Claude as an inorganic being, expounding at length on her freedom from lowly human traits. He gave me a photocopy of the text saying, "Be careful, this is the only one in existence." I dug it up. It was buried in the second attention. The witches and I had to hunt for it in dreaming. It's steeped in another world. Amy, read it overnight. I need your editorial suggestions now. The Art of Dreaming moved me the least of Carlos' books, Wallace says, and was in desperate need of copy editing. It read like a heavy-handed science fiction, with Carlos moving through spongy tunnels into other worlds in dreaming, ever in peril of not finding his way back to his sleeping body. In spite of this Buck Rogers action, the book was rather dry, lacking the wonderful dialogue with Don Juan that had made the early books so enchanting. Don Juan made some appearances, but now spoke as if he were a tiresome academic. I slogged on, finally arriving at Carol Tiggs' introduction to the story. Carlos had instructed me to take special note of this. Though the writing remained labored, at last the subject matter intrigued me. Carlos did expand on what I'd learned about Carol and the Death Defier, revealing that this creature had lived for 27 generations as a man and woman, trading mystic favors for a body. But Castaneda refused favors from this most magical of all beings, a point he emphasized to me. He said, "If you or anyone offers me pity, I'll spit in your eye. I'm the Nagual of freedom. I live only to break your chains." On his dreaming tours, Carlos claimed to have encountered a waif-like blue-hued child, skinny and etheric, who called out to be freed from an astral dungeon where she had been a prisoner for time beyond measure. Carlos found her pleas irresistible, and in defiance of Don Juan, for the task was dangerous, he resolved to save her. The Death Defier mysteriously entered Carol Tiggs' supposedly merging forces, and together they saved the child. Back on the physical plane, a little girl was said to be born of Carlos and Carol's union. Carol referred to Carol as his sister, further complicating matters. The Blue Scout reportedly emerged from Carol's womb, a baby with adult characteristics such as freakishly long fingers. This baby was now 30 years old. The adventure nearly destroyed Castaneda, and his cohorts hovered over him as he hung between life and death. The girl, though she had several names, was most commonly called Claude by her intimates. Carol, too, had a power name. She was revealed to me with cloak and dagger excitement. She was Muni Alexander. In the ever-shifting stories, Claude was brought up by Don Juan and companions, or largely by little Florinda. Alternately, she was raised in orphanages and reclaimed by Carlos as a teenager. Carol/Muni nursed Carlos back to health, still retaining the Death Defier. This possession raised a quandary for the sorcerers. Carlos was the last of the line, so what would become of the Death Defier, and what would happen to Claude, the alien spawn of two Naguals, godlike loins? From then on, when Carlos spoke to me of these matters, he no longer referred to metaphors. He now insisted on their literal truth of these tales. A dramatic change of tune. I was coming to believe that Claude, aka the Blue Scout, was indeed a superior creature. The power of Carlos' repetition and my own spiritual seeking conspired to conquer my inclinations to see his teachings as a metaphor. Wallace says, the female counterpart to the Nagual, Carol Tiggs, allegedly disappeared into the second attention for 10 years. Channels the Death Defier, a supernatural character from the book Art of Dreaming. Castaneda states publicly that Muni, or Carol, controls us. She holds us all in the palm of her hand. Years later, she was the one that won probate for the will of Castaneda, and in an interview says that she has reached an empty, egoless state of being. "I have attained inner silence," she declared. When asked about her supernatural abilities, Carol generally tells questioners, "You don't have the equipment to comprehend my words because you are not on my level. We'll discuss it when you have advanced." Now, Wallace says that it is Patricia Partin that is known as the Blue Scout, a being from the inorganic world incarnated physically through the Nagual women and the Nagual Castaneda introduced privately and publicly as their daughter. Castaneda alternately claims his daughter was raised by Don Juan, was raised by Florinda, was found in an orphanage, and tells Ellis that she despises men and has the emotional capacity of a 7-year-old. Claude has the power to select and reject members of the inner circle, which she exercises with severity, is said to be violently jealous and egoless being. Castaneda announces that she possesses non-human sexual organs and appears normal when she dances naked for the inner circle. She was last seen leaving Castaneda's home shortly after his death, and stalkers reportedly seeing her driving in Los Angeles over a 2-week period thereafter. However, certain inner circle members are told that she burned from within inside the house or burned with the Nagual. Her car is soon found abandoned in Death Valley. In early May of '98, only weeks after Carlos' death, Patty Partin was adopted daughter and lover, aka the Blue Scout, left her red Ford Escort in the parking lot near the head of the hiking trail in the Panamint Dunes in Death Valley, east of Los Angeles. Paperwork in the glove box of the car led the police to the Clear Green office in Los Angeles. Carlos told me several times that if the Blue Scout failed to go with me to an infinity, all she had to do was get in her little red car and drive very, very fast into the desert, where the car with her in it would ascend to a higher plane. In February 2003, skeletal remains were found by hikers in the sand dunes near Panamint Springs. Sheriff investigator Marcin Mattweiler suspects the bones are Partin's, but has no proof. 3 years later, in February of 2006, Partin's family, after an advancement in technology, obtained the DNA samples from the body, and remains were identified as Miss Partin's. So we have this background of who this person is, the Blue Scout, somebody that was close to Carlos Castaneda. And so another interesting thing, just as a final note, when I started to read about other theories about Don Juan, Wallace goes to a radio hour where she speaks to Haynes Eli, and Haynes had known Florinda Grau and a number of the witches, but not Carlos, and had gone camping with them. He told me that one credible story about the possible identity of Don Juan, according to Haynes, in Carlos' early days of seeking his doctorate, he went to Mexico, as he always said, in search of medicinal plants. There he encountered an elderly Yaqui Indian, grandfather Cachorra, with whom he struck a deal. Cachorra offered to teach Carlos sorcery enough, it turned out, for 3 books, which would become bestsellers and make him famous and wealthy. By the original deal, half the proceeds for the books would go to Carlos, the other half to grandfather, who would share them with the Yaqui and improve their standard of living. Cachorra and helpers concocted potions from psychedelic plants and gave them to Carlos. Apparently, Carlos began to insist he could fly. The attending Yaqui Indians were forced to tie him to a tree with leather straps to prevent him from jumping into a ravine. Carlos fought back furiously and struggled to free himself. He, in fact, wrote eloquently about this in one of his books. The 3 books were #1 bestsellers. However, Carlos reneged on his promise and kept all the profits. Then, according to Haynes, Carlos had the temerity to return and ask for more lessons. For not being a man of his word, he was sent away. So we have this as a background to understand. We have now traveled to the world of inorganic beings. We've discussed the movement of the assemblage point, and we've discussed entering the shadows world. All of this encompassing a sort of way to learn how to lucidly dream, and that there is this art of dreaming. And in this last episode, he has announced that he's here to save the Scout, which could put him in major harm. But at the end of the last episode in the Shadows world, it ended, he yelled loud and clear my intent to merge my energy with the energy of that prisoner Scout and set it free. The Blue Scout. I was dreaming, an utterly nonsensical dream. Carol Tiggs was by my side. She was speaking to me, although I could not understand what she said. Don Juan was also in my dream, as were all the members of his party. They seemed to be trying to drag me out of a foggy, yellowish world. After a serious effort, during which I lost and regained sight of them various times, they succeeded in extricating me from that place. Since I could not conceive the sense of all that endeavor, I finally figured that I was having a normal, incoherent dream. My surprise was staggering when I woke up and found myself in bed in Don Juan's house. I was incapable of moving. I had no energy at all. I did not know what to think. Although I immediately sensed the gravity of my situation, I had the vague feeling that I had lost my energy because of fatigue caused by dreaming. Don Juan's companions seemed to be extremely affected by whatever was happening to me. They kept on coming into my room one at a time. Each stayed for a moment in complete silence until someone else showed up. It appeared to me that they were taking turns watching over me. I was too weak to ask them to explain their behavior. During the subsequent days, I began to feel better, and they started to talk to me about my dreaming. At first, I did not know what they wanted of me. Then it dawned on me, because of their questions, they were obsessed with the shadow beings. Every one of them appeared to be scared and said to be more or less the same thing. They insisted they had never been in the shadows world. Some of them even claimed they did not know it existed. Their claims and reactions increased my sense of bewilderment and my fear. The questions everyone asked were, who took you into the world? Or how did you even begin to know how to get there? Now there's a side note. He does meet an inorganic being and is in conversation with something called the dream emissary for much of that last chapter. We learn the dream emissary does not lie and is sort of a voice in his head. When I told them that the scouts had shown me that world, they could not believe me. Obviously, they had surmised that I had been there, but since it was not possible for them to use their personal experience as a reference point, they were unable to fathom what I was saying. Yet they still wanted to know all I could tell them about the shadow being and their realm. I obliged them, all of them with the exception of Don Juan, sat by my bed, hanging on every word I said. However, every time I asked them about my situation, they scurried away, just like the shadow beings. Another disturbing reaction, which they never had before, was they frantically avoided any physical contact with me. They kept their distance as if I were carrying the plague. Their reaction worried me so much that I felt obliged to ask them about it. They denied it. They seemed insulted and even went so far as to insist on proving to me that I was wrong. I laughed heartily at the tense situation that ensued. Their bodies went rigid every time they tried to embrace me. Florinda Donner-Grau, Don Juan's closest cohort, was the only member of his party who lavished physical attention on me and tried to explain to me what was going on. She told me that I had been discharged of energy in the inorganic being's world and charged again, but that my new energetic charge was a bit disturbing to the majority of them. Florinda used to put me to bed every night as if I were an invalid. She even spoke to me in baby talk, which all of them celebrated with gales of laughter. But regardless of how she made fun of me, I appreciated her concern, which seemed to be real. I've written about Florinda before in connection with my meeting her. She was by far the most beautiful woman I had ever met. Once I said to her, and I really meant it, that she could have been a fashion magazine model of a magazine of 1910, she retorted. Florinda, although she was old, was not old at all. She was young and vibrant. When I asked Don Juan about her unusual youthfulness, she replied that sorcery kept her in a vital state. Sorcerer's energy, he remarked, was seen by the eye as youth and vigor. After satisfying their initial curiosity about the shadows world, Don Juan's companions stopped coming into my room, and their conversation remained at the level of casual inquiries about my health. Every time I tried to get up, however, there was someone around who gently put me back to bed. I did not want their ministrations, yet it seemed that I needed them. I was weak. I accepted that. But what really took its toll on me was not having anyone explain to me what I was doing in Mexico when I had gone to bed to dream in Los Angeles. I asked them repeatedly. Every one of them gave me the same answer. Ask the Nagual. He's the only one who can explain it. Finally, Florinda broke the ice. You were lured into a trap. That's what's happened to you, she said. Where was I lured into a trap? In the world of the inorganic beings, of course. That has been the world you've been dealing with for years, isn't that so? Most definitely, Florinda. You are not sick with an illness. You were energetically wounded. You were critical, but how are you only gravely wounded? How did all this happen? You entered into a mortal combat with the inorganic beings and you were defeated. I don't remember fighting anyone, Florinda. Whether you remembered or not is immaterial. You fought and were outclassed. You didn't have a chance against those masterful manipulators. I fought the inorganic beings? Yes, you had a mortal encounter with them. I really don't know how you have survived their death blow." She refused to tell me anything else and hinted that the Nagual was coming to see me any day. The next day, Don Juan showed up. He was very jovial and supportive. He jokingly announced that he was paying me a visit in his capacity of energy doctor. He examined me by gazing at me from head to toe. "You're almost cured," he concluded. "What happened to me, Don Juan?" I asked. "You fell into a trap the inorganic being set for you," he answered. "How did I end up here?" "Right, there's the big mystery for sure," he said, and smiled jovially, obviously trying to make light of a serious matter. "The inorganic beings snatched you, body and all, first took your energy body into their realm. Then you followed one of their scouts and they took your physical body." Don Juan's companions seemed to be in a state of shock. One of them asked Don Juan whether the inorganic beings could abduct anyone. Don Juan answered they certainly could. He reminded them that Nagual Elias was taken into that universe and he definitely did not intend to go there. All of them assented with a nod. Don Juan continued speaking to them, referring to me in the third person. He said that the combined awareness of a group of inorganic beings had first consumed my energy body by forcing an emotional outburst from me to free the Blue Scout. Then, the combined awareness of the same group of inorganic beings had pulled my inert physical mass into the world. Don Juan added that without the energy body, one is merely a lump of organic matter that can be easily manipulated by awareness. "The inorganic beings are glued together like the cells of a body," Don Juan went on. "When they put their awareness together, they are unbeatable. It's nothing for them to yank us out of our moorings and plunge us into their world, especially if we make ourselves conspicuous and available like he did." Their sighs and gasps echoed against the walls. All of them seemed to be genuinely frightened and concerned. I wanted to whine and blame Don Juan for not stopping me, but I remembered how he had tried to warn me, to deviate me, time and time again to no avail. Don Juan was definitely aware of what was going on in my mind. He gave a knowing smile. "The reason you think you're sick," he said, addressing me, "is that the inorganic beings discharged your energy and gave you theirs. That should have been enough to kill anyone. As the Nagual, you have extra energy, therefore you barely survived." I mentioned to Don Juan that I remembered bits and pieces of quite an incoherent dream in which I was in a yellow-fogged world. He, Carol Tiggs, and his companions were pulling me out. "The inorganic being's realm looks like a yellow fog world to the physical eye," he said. "When you thought you were having an incoherent dream, you were actually looking with your physical eyes for the first time at the inorganic being's universe. And strange as it may seem to you, it was also the first time for us. We knew about the fog only through sorcerer stories, not through experience." Nothing of what he was saying made sense to me. Don Juan assured me that because of my lack of energy, a more complete explanation was impossible. I had to be satisfied, he said, with what he was telling me and how I understood it. "I don't understand it at all," I insisted. "Then you haven't lost anything," he said. "When you get stronger, you yourself will answer your questions." I confessed to Don Juan that I was having hot flashes. My temperatures rose suddenly, and while I felt hot and sweaty, I had extraordinary but disturbing insights into my situation. Don Juan scanned my entire body with his penetrating gaze. He said that I was in a state of energetic shock. Losing energy had temporarily affected me, and what I interpreted as hot flashes were in essence blasts of energy during which I momentarily regained control of my energy body and knew everything that had happened to me. "Make an effort and tell me yourself what happened to you in the inorganic being's world," he ordered me. I told him that the clear sensation I got from time to time was that he and his companions had gone into that world with their physical bodies and had snatched me out of the inorganic being's clutches. "Right," he exclaimed. "You're doing fine. Now turn that sensation into a view of what happened." I was unable to do what he wanted, hard as I tried. Failing made me experience an unusual fatigue, which seemed to dry up the inside of my body. Before Don Juan left the room, I remarked to him that I was suffering from anxiety. "That means nothing," he said, unconcerned. "Gain back your energy and don't worry about nonsense." More than 2 weeks went by, during which I slowly gained back my energy. However, I kept on worrying about everything. I worried mainly about being unknown to myself, especially about a streak of coldness in me that I had not noticed before, a sort of indifference. a detachment that I had attributed to my lack of energy until I regained it. Then I realized that it was a new feature of my being, a feature that had me permanently out of synchronization. To elicit the feelings I was accustomed to, I had to summon them up and actually wait a moment until they made their appearance in my mind. Another new feature of my being was a strange longing that took hold of me from time to time. I longed for someone I did not know. It was such an overpowering and consuming feeling that when I experienced it, I had to move around the room incessantly to alleviate it, the longing remaining with me until I made use of another newcomer in my life, a rigid control of myself, so new and powerful that it only added more fuel to my worrying. By the end of the 4th week, everybody felt that I was finally cured. They cut down their visits drastically. I spent much of the time alone sleeping. The rest and relaxation I was getting was so complete that my energy began to increase remarkably. I felt like my old self again. I began to exercise. One day around noon, after a light lunch, I returned to my room to take a nap. Just before I sank into a deep sleep, I was tossing in my bed trying to find a more comfortable spot when a strange pressure on my temples made me open my eyes. The little girl of the inorganic being's world was standing by the foot of my bed, peering at me with her cold, steel blue eyes. I jumped out of bed and screamed so loudly that 3 of Don Juan's companions were in the room before I had stopped my scream. They were aghast. They watched in horror as the little girl came to me and was stopped by the boundaries of my luminous physical being. We looked at each other for an eternity. She was telling me something which I could not comprehend at first, but which in the next moment became as clear as a bell. She said that for me to understand what she was saying, my awareness had to be transferred from my physical body into my energy body. Don Juan came into the room at that moment. The little girl and Don Juan stared at each other. Without a word, Don Juan turned around and walked out of the room. The little girl swished past the door after him. The commotion this scene created among Don Juan's companions was indescribable. They all lost their composure. Apparently all of them had seen the little girl as she left the room with the Nagual. I myself seemed to be on the verge of exploding. I felt faint and had to sit down. I had experienced the presence of the little girl as a blow on my solar plexus. She bore an astonishing likeness to my father. Waves of sentiment hit me. I wondered about the meaning of this until I was actually sick. When Don Juan returned to the room, I had gained minimal control over myself. The expectation of hearing what he had to say about the little girl was making my breathing very difficult. Everybody was excited as I was. They all talked Don Juan at once and laughed when they realized what they were doing. Their main interest was to find out whether there was any uniformity in the way they had perceived the scout's appearance. Everybody was in agreement they had seen a little girl, 6 to 7 years old, very thin with angular, beautiful features. They also agreed that her eyes were steel blue and burning with a mute emotion. Her eyes, they said, expressed gratitude and loyalty. Every detail they described about the little girl I corroborated myself. Her eyes were so bright and overpowering, they had actually caused me something like pain. I had felt the weight of her look on my chest. A serious query which Don Juan's companions had, and which I echoed myself, was about the implications of this event. All agreed that the scout was a portion of foreign energy that had filtered through the walls separating the second attention and the attention of the daily world. They asserted that since they were not dreaming and yet all of them had seen the alien energy projected into the figure of the human child, the child had existence. They argued that there must have been hundreds if not thousands of cases in which foreign energy slips unnoticed through the natural barriers into our human world, but that in the history of their lineage there was no mention whatsoever of an event of this nature. What worried them the most was there was no sorcerer stories about it. Is this the first time in the history of mankind this has happened? One of them asked Don Juan. I think it happens all the time, he replied, but it has never happened in such an overt, volitional way. What does it mean to us? Another one of them asked Don Juan. Nothing to us, but everything to him. He pointed at me. All of them then entered into a most disturbing silence. Don Juan paced back and forth for a moment, then he stopped in front of me and peered at me, giving all the indications of someone who could not find words to express an overwhelming realization. I can't even begin to assess the scope of what you've done, Don Juan finally said to me in a tone of bewilderment. You fell into a pitfall, but it wasn't the kind of pitfall I was worrying about. Your pitfall was designed for you alone, and it was deadlier than anything I could have thought of. I worried about you falling prey to flattery and being served. What I never counted on was that the shadow beings would set a trap using your inherent aversion to chains. Don Juan had once made a comparison of his reaction and mine in the sorcerer's world to the things that pressed us the most. He said, without making it sound like a complaint, that although he wanted to and tried to, he had never been able to inspire the kind of affection his teacher, the Nagual Julian, inspired in people. My unbiased reaction, which I am putting on the table for you to examine, is to be able to say and mean it. It's not my fate to evoke blind and total affection, so be it. Your unbiased reaction, he went on, is that you can't stand chains and you would forfeit your life to break them. I sincerely disagreed with him, and he told me he was exaggerating. My views were not that clear. Don't worry, he said, laughing. Sorcery is action. When the time comes, you'll act your passion the same way I act mine. Mine is to acquiesce to my fate, not passively like an idiot, but actively like a warrior. Yours is to jump without either capriciousness or premeditation to cut someone else's chains. Don Juan explained that upon merging my energy with the scout, I had truthfully ceased to exist. All my physicalness had been transported into the inorganic being's realm, and had it not been for the scout who guided Don Juan and his companions to where I was, I would have died or remained in the world inextricably lost. Why did the scout guide you to where I was? I asked. The scout is a sentient being from another dimension, he said. It's a little girl now, and as such, she told me that in order to get the necessary energy to break the barrier that trapped her in the inorganic being's world, she had to take all of yours. That's her human part now. Something resembling gratitude drove her to me. When I saw her, I knew instantly that you were done for. What did you do then, Don Juan? I rounded up everyone I could get a hold of, especially Carol Tiggs, and off we went into the inorganic being's realm. Why Carol Tiggs? In the first place, because she has endless energy, and in the second place, because she had to familiarize herself with the scout. All of us got something invaluable out of this experience. You and Carol Tiggs got the scout, and the rest of us got reason to round up our physicality and place it on our energy bodies. We became energy. How did all of you do that, Don Juan? We displaced our assemblage points in unison. Our impeccable intent to save you did the work. The scout took us, in the blink of an eye, to where you were lying half dead, and Carol dragged you out. His explanation made no sense to me. Don Juan laughed when I tried to raise that point. How can you understand this when you don't even have enough energy to get out of your bed? He retorted. I confided to him that I was certain I knew infinitely more than I rationally admitted, but that something was keeping a tight lid on my memory. Lack of energy is what put a tight lid on your memory, he said. When you have sufficient energy, your memory will work fine. Do you mean that I can remember everything I want to? Not quite. You may want as much as you like, but if your energy level is not on a par with the importance of what you know, you might as well kiss your knowledge goodbye. It'll never be available to you. So what's the thing to do, Don Juan? Energy tends to be cumulative. If you follow the warrior's way impeccably, a moment will come when your memory opens up. I confess that hearing him talk gave me the absurd sensation that I was indulging in feeling sorry for myself. There was nothing wrong with me. You are not just indulging, he said. You were actually energetically dead 4 weeks ago. Now you are merely stunned. Being stunned and lacking energy is what makes you hide your knowledge. You certainly know more than any of us about the inorganic being's world. That world was the exclusive concern of the old sorcerers. All of us have told you that only through sorcerer stories do we know about it. I sincerely say that it is more than strange to me that you become in your own right another source of sorcerer stories for us. I reiterated that it was impossible for me to believe that I had done something he had not, but I could not believe either that he was merely humoring me. I'm not flattering or humoring you, he said, visibly annoyed. I am stating a sorcery fact. Knowing more than any of us about that world shouldn't be a reason for feeling pleased. There's no advantage in that knowledge. In fact, in spite of it all, you know you couldn't save yourself. We saved you because we found you. But without the aid of the scout, there was no point in even trying to find you. You were so infinitely lost in that world that I shudder at the mere thought. In my state of mind, I did not find it strange in the least that I actually saw a ripple of emotion going through all of Don Juan's companions and apprentices. The only one who remained unaltered was Carol Tiggs. She seemed to have fully accepted her role. She was one with me. You did free the scout, Don Juan continued, but you gave up your life, or worse yet, you gave up your freedom. The inorganic beings let the scout go in exchange for you. I can hardly believe that, Don Juan. Not that I doubt you. You understand, but you describe such an underhanded maneuver that I am stunned. Don't consider it underhanded, and you have the whole thing in a nutshell. The inorganic beings are forever in search of awareness and energy. If you supply them with the possibility of both, what do you think they'll do? Blow you kisses from across the street? I knew that Don Juan was right. However, I could not hold that certainly for too long clarity kept drifting away from me. Don Juan's companions continued asking him questions. They wanted to know if he had given any thought to what to do with the scout. Yes, I have. It is a most serious problem which the Nagual here has to resolve, he said, pointing at me. He and Carol Tiggs are the only ones who can free the scout, and he knows it too. Naturally, I asked him the only possible question. How can I free it? Instead of my telling you how, there is a much better and more just way of finding out, Don Juan said with a big smile. Ask the emissary. The inorganic beings cannot lie, you know. And that's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is the third gate of dreaming, and we'll see if we cover that one. I do want to step back at some point and do a sort of meta-analysis of the book, The Art of Dreaming, as a way to actively lucid dream. I've had some episodes on lucid dreaming. I have some lucid dreaming meditations, and it comes at it from a totally different aspect. Understanding the gates of dreaming is a very interesting model to understanding the different ways that you can become lucid while dreaming. But aside from that, understanding the background is very interesting, that these characters that were involved in his life became a part of his writing, and it feels genuine and authentic, even though it could have been just stories that he was writing. And there's something about the story, like she claimed, it seemed like science fiction. It's enjoyable, it's fun. He has a certain way of writing that even if it's fictional, I enjoy it, and I do get some learning out of it, and it really makes me wonder, did they pull him out of the inorganic world and back into Mexico? And if that's possible, maybe someday we'll be able to travel through the inorganic world to anywhere we want in the earth. If we make some sort of agreement with the inorganic beings, hey, we'll just travel through here and we can start doing that, and that's something that could be possible, right? In any case, I'd love to get your feelings both on Carlos Castaneda and Amy Wallace information and this chapter in the book. If you want me to keep going, I'm happy to continue on this exploration of Carlos Castaneda, because it is fascinating. In particular, this book, The Art of Dreaming, really awakens a curiosity and a deeper desire to learn more about the art of lucid dreaming. And I really want to look at the teachings of indigenous peoples as to this art. I think there's some science and art to this that we can learn from other sources outside of what we have now. That's one of the reasons that this work appealed so much to so many people at the beginning, was you can feel like there's this sort of spiritual knowledge that we can get from certain societies, Indian societies, Toltecs, that whole thing. And we don't have this information. It would be wonderful if we could know if we're getting some valid, authentic information. But obviously it was very popular and a lot of people have talked about it. I do want to do an episode sometime on Carlos Castaneda's discussion of sex, which is super fascinating, as discussed by Amy Wallace, and sort of coincides with the law of one in the raw material. But we'll get to that on another day. In any case, I'd love to get your impressions of the Blue Scout and anything else that you might want to comment on. I'd love to know how your explorations have gone in lucid dreaming. In any case, all episodes of The Reality Revolution can be found at therealityrevolution.com. And welcome to The Reality Revolution.